Somewhere between the edge of being alive and feeling dead.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about Docker containers. We're going to discuss a simple PHP application, how to turn it into a Docker container environment, and then we're going to talk a little bit about TrueNAS scale and how you can deploy it there and why you'd want to do that. So let's begin. So starting off, it's a really simple PHP based application that I created. I have some videos on this, how to install it, all that. We're not going to get into the details, but just to do a quick overview of this application. It's just like a membership sign up application. So there's a video up here to a link to a video showing a YouTube clip of how to sign up. And really any club could use this system. You just modify it to fit your needs. But if I click here on this first link, the electronic form comes up to this form. You kind of fill it out, right? And I guess the key thing here would be this email address field. You fill out these fields. If you don't, like if I were to click submit, right, you got to fill out the required fields. Eventually you will need an access code, and you will go email a code, and that'll send an email with a 6-digit number, and you'll have to check your email account, put the 6-digit number here, and then you can submit the form. And that's just a way of verifying that you have access to that email address. It's really you. And what'll happen is you fill out this form, it will create a PDF form with all the fields filled in. It'll email a copy to you and to the membership director. So that's how that's going to work. Anyway, very simple application made in PHP. And up here you can see in the address bar, this is just a PHP application installed on my local computer here. And so that introduces some challenges. That means, I run on Linux, so I have to install all the software in order to host this environment on my local computer. And so when I get security updates or when I upgrade the version of Linux that I'm running, some of you might be running Windows or Mac operating system, you get those updates, and sometimes they break existing software that's running. So I have an environment that could be changing, and plus I have to install everything, certain versions of a web server, in this case Apache, certain versions of PHP, and other things like any dependencies that this software requires. So that's all done on my computer, and this is an environment, it's a development environment, so things are always changing, so it's easy to break applications. So that's something to think about. So let's talk a little bit about what is Docker anyway. So Docker says here a container is a standard unit of software that packages up code and all of its dependencies so that applications run quickly and reliably from one computing environment to another. A Docker container image is a lightweight standalone executable package of software that includes everything needed to run an application: the code, the runtime, the system tools, the system libraries, and settings. Okay, so Docker, so it packages up software and it allows that software to run consistently on different types of environments, right? For example, I create an image that has this application. I create a Docker image that lets me deploy it on Linux and Windows and Mac, different places like that, and get a consistent experience. So that's one thing, and we'll get into more details. So you might be asking yourself the question, okay, what's the difference between Docker and a virtual machine? It sounds very similar to what a virtual machine does. There is a big difference. So here on Amazon, it talks about a virtual machine emulates hardware components of a physical machine, like the CPU, memory, network interface, USB, controller, sound cards, all that. You can run a guest operating system and multiple applications. Basically, a virtual machine is like a virtual copy of everything on your desktop. It could be all the software, like, it could be PHP, Apache, plus antivirus software, everything that you would install in an environment. Plus, it emulates all the pieces of hardware in your PC. But Docker says here, Docker, a VM lets you run virtual machine on any hardware. Docker lets you run an application on any operating system. It uses isolated user space instances known as containers. So that's an interesting difference. A Docker container is all about software, and a virtual machine is kind of about everything, the hardware, the software, all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of in a nutshell the difference. So why would I want to, well, you know, whatever. You came here, you want to learn about Docker, so let's talk a bit about it. So here we have this simple application. It lets you fill out forms. It sends the filled out forms in an email to you and the membership director. It's got a bunch of links here. It's a pretty simple PHP application. How would I turn that into a Docker image? Let's talk a little bit about that. So here I have this project on GitHub. It's called Membership Sign Up. We've got a bunch of folders. We've got a bunch of files, all PHP based. Okay. And what I've done is I've created this Docker folder here. And in the Docker folder, we've got a bunch of files. We've got a README file that talks all about how to set it up. But the basic gist is this. So in the main folder, we have all the files that make up the application. In these folders, we have different PHP applications. It's structured in a certain way. And all those files need to make their way into a Docker image somehow. So in this Docker folder, what I have is this folder here, 2204, and I have a Docker file, and that's where everything starts. If you're going to package up that software, you start with a Docker file. So let's take a look at that. So here in this Docker file, I'm not going to explain all the details about how a Docker file works, but I'll just touch on the highlights. So the first thing is, this is based on an image that exists out there, another Docker image. So someone's put together this Fusion base image. It's basically a Debian Linux environment, minimal Debian Linux environment, or Ubuntu or something like that. I think it's Ubuntu. Very, very small footprint. It's a Linux environment, and that's the base that I'm starting with, okay? And after that, I am creating some environment variables. Okay, all of these are environment variables, and these are configuration parameters that I can override in my application. This PHP application uses a config.php file to configure how it should run. And so in that code, you're going to see, each one of these environment variables is a setting. So if I pass these environment variables with certain values, it will override the values in that config.php file. So anyways, this is all documentation. So the long story short is the Docker file kind of describes how to package up the software, how to configure it, and how to grab the dependencies. So these are configuration parameters that I can override, and I can further override these on command line. We'll talk about that. All right, and then these are commands I'm going to run to start up Linux itself. More commands here to set permissions, more setting of permissions. Okay, keep going. Down here is where I'm doing more configuration. I'm actually adding the latest version of PHP. So this is going to install, I think, PHP, I've specified here 8.3. Okay, that's the version of PHP we're installing on this image. So I install PHP 8.3. I also am installing a web server, Apache, and I'm installing the dependency that this uses, any other dependencies, but the main one here is PDFTK. So in this line, this is configuring this image, which is based on Linux. It's installing a web server, PHP, and some dependent libraries. After that, it's configuring the web server. And then down here, we are adding a bunch of supporting scripts so that when it starts up, it starts Apache, etc. I'm configuring time zones, setting more permissions, and then down here I'm installing Composer, which will then install all the dependencies my PHP application has. None of this stuff here is Docker specific. These are things that you would normally do manually to install the environment. But this is all described in the Docker file. So as I come down here, it's doing a bunch of those steps. And now down here is where I'm adding files to the Docker image. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing, for example, if I look at the folder here, it's going to grab the directory docker/app and create a folder in the Docker image called /app and copy the files from Docker app to that. So I'm here in this Docker folder. If I look in app, right, there's a few folders here. They will get copied into the Docker image. And then down here, all of these add statements will add source code into the Docker image. So all the PHP files in the root folder. So all the PHP files here, and then JSON, lock files, XML. I've got lock twice. I guess I can clean that up. Cache, the cache directory, the config directory. So all these subfolders, everything that needs to get deployed for a proper installation. This is almost like an install shield script, right? Only it's creating a Docker image. And then at the end, we run the system, okay? So this is sort of a very quick discussion of this thing called a Docker file. In addition to that, if I look back, there's also this dockerfile.docker ignore. This is where you'd specify do not add any of these files into the Docker image. So any kind of Git files, change logs, README files, license files, certain things that in the Docker file itself, I don't want those packaged into the Docker image itself. All right. So coming back to the documentation, it says here to build a new Docker image, you just run docker build, point it to the image name. In this case, it's called Softcoder Membership Signup Latest. And where is that defined? Well, that image is posted here on Docker Hub. You'll see up here, Softcoder Membership Signup. And yes, Docker Hub has thousands and thousands of Docker images for people who have created images for their software. So there's something already there. You can either pull it into your Docker file as a base image and extend it, or you can just deploy it. So that's kind of a pretty cool concept. So to build it, you specify the image name, the version, they call that the tag. I want the latest image of membership signup, and then point it to the Docker file that will tell it the build instructions. So you run that and it creates a Docker image. So I've already done that. Now, in order to connect to run the Docker image, let's talk about running it. You call docker run. And then you have to pass a bunch of command line parameters to, let's say, I already have, so I'm already running. Let's take a look here on my local system. We were just doing that. So we can see here, I already have an Apache web server running on here on port 80 on my local Linux system. So if I were to run this docker run command with port 80 mapped to port 80 on my local host, it's not going to work because port 80 is already in use. So in that case, I would need to pick a different port that's not in use. So the first parameter is the port on your local host, and the next one is the port on the Docker image itself. So on the Docker image, port 80, on the local host, it's something else. So I'm overriding those port assignments, and then of course those environment variables that I talked about before, I can override their values. So here I could say, the PHP application has a few configuration parameters that are required to make it work, and then of course the image name. So I want to run this Docker image, and it's Softcoder Membership Signup Latest. So it's going to pull this image from Docker Hub. It's going to override the configuration parameters and fire it up. So let's show an example of that. So first let's get over here and let's refresh this. So you can notice I put the port number there, 8080, and nothing is running on my local host here. And so now I'm going to run this command, which does Docker run with a bunch of overridden parameters. And it's started up. Now let's see what happens if I refresh this. Boom. On port 8080, I have a Docker image running. And I can click on the form and I can run it. And this is all running in a container. Now, I should mention a few things interesting to note about containers. And that is everything that happens in the container by default, when you shut the container down, they're not saved. You think of it like a read-only image that, yes, you can write to the disk while the image is running, but all the changes disappear when you shut down that Docker container. So it's completely isolated. Interesting to know. So if you have log files and all that, by default, the changes will disappear. Now you can override that with something called volumes, but we'll talk about that later. So for now, we have this web server running. Now I'm going to connect to this Docker image. And what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to find out, okay, this image is running right here, and it gave it a name. Every time you run a Docker image, it gives it a random name and a random container ID over here. So I did that to see the name, and now I'm going to connect to that image, Docker execute this command, or sorry, this image, and execute bash. So I'm going to get a command prompt and basically remote into that Docker container. So here I am. I'm in this Docker container. And I can take a look, and I can take a look at the app folder, and this has my PHP application deployed in here. Okay. And I can take a look at the application log. Right now it's empty, but all the files in here are basically any persistence that's made. Like I said, they will not be saved unless you use something called volumes. So this is really cool to be able to test this out. And let's say I did want to save things like any of these these PDF forms that get created, that get emailed. They get created on disk. Let's say I wanted that to not disappear if I stop and restart the Docker image, because maybe I upgraded or I make changes or I change configuration and I need to restart it. You can map certain folders and files, and you can say map it to a certain place on the localhost machine and keep the changes there. So you can do things like that. I'm not going to get into those details, but I'm just pointing that out. So this is pretty cool. Now, still, all of that is happening on this local machine, on my desktop, my Linux desktop. The first thing we showed was, okay, this is running using software that's installed on this machine in a complicated way. It's brittle, like a web server, a version of PHP. And every time I get updates through Linux, that could change the version of PHP. It could change the configuration and version of my web server. That's not good. So then I took a step and we looked at, okay, let's create a Docker image. That's good, because I can make changes to that, and no matter what happens on my desktop here, that Docker image is safe. It's going to use the version of PHP and the operating system and the web server that I want. And even though my local host gets updated with security changes and stuff, this Docker image will have a consistent environment that's not impacted. So that's great. But now, how do I deploy that somewhere else? I don't want to run web servers on my local desktop. I want to deploy it on a server somewhere. So let's talk a bit about that. All right, so we're in TrueNAS Scale, and we went to the apps section. And what I've done is I created this custom app. Well, let's take a look at the configuration here. So you can create a custom app. And what that basically means is you can point The app may not have been in the software list for TrueCharts and all that kind of thing, or it may not be a native IX application, but you can pull any application from Docker Hub or any other place that has a Docker image. And so you can see here, you create a new custom application, you give it a name, you specify the image repository. So softcoder membership signup, that's this up here. That's the repository name. And then the image tag says latest here, and that's all the tags that are supported down here in this tag area. And then we'll just pick the latest version like we did. And you can say pull new images if they exist on the host. So on Docker Hub, if there's an upgrade, then yeah, pull it down and upgrade that software. And override those environment variables. Setting email, account, and what else can I do? Port forwarding, so I can say, all right, this is running on TrueNAS. Port 80 is already in use by something. So instead of port 80 being exposed, I'm going to have this application on port 9480. You can pick whatever port that's not in use there. And then scrolling down a bit more, that's down here at the bottom. Yeah, portal configuration. Yeah. So this is just saying, okay, is there a web user interface? Yes, there is. And it's at 9480. And when you do this, you'll notice that you get a link to the IP address of this Docker container with that port. And that's just a way of launching into the user interface of that. So let's try this out, okay? And so now I'm going to start this image. I have it configured. And you can see here this membership sign up portal. Okay, so we can see the application has started up, and now I will click on the portal, go to the web user interface, and there you can see on port 9480, indeed it has started up and it is serving the application in a Docker container. So that's pretty cool. And down here, how do I connect? I can get a shell by clicking on this icon, and I can look at the logs by looking at that icon. All the same concepts we were looking at here earlier. You can connect into the Docker container, take a look, and by default nothing will be persisted. So that's kind of a quick overview of getting a simple PHP application, making it into a Docker container, and how to get that Docker container into TrueNAS. Let's take a quick look of where I did that. Okay, so you'll be asking, how do you install a custom app like this membership sign up and pull an image from Docker Hub? So you go Apps, Discover Apps, Custom App right here. And this is where you're going to create your brand new definition for your app. So, you know, my membership sign up, whatever. It can't be any spaces, I guess. You can put dashes. You would put the image repository. All the settings I showed you earlier, you configure it all here. And then you click install, and that's going to pull the Docker image from the host you specified and from Docker Hub down to your TrueNAS scale, and it will now show up under apps, and you can control it like any other. So that's kind of the quick summary. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.